They dismissed him as just another quiet resident. Dr. Marcus Chun worked the night shift, kept to himself, never joined colleagues for drinks. But when the hospital's emergency broadcast crackled to life that Tuesday night, everything changed. If you want to see how this story of hidden courage unfolds, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the trauma bay of St. Mary's General Hospital. Dr. Marcus Chun adjusted his stethoscope and glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Another quiet night on the graveyard shift, exactly how he preferred it. At 28, he had already earned a reputation among the nursing staff as competent but distant, professional but cold, that he moved through his rounds with mechanical precision, checking on the handful of patients admitted to the emergency department. Room 3 held an elderly man with chest pains, stable but requiring observation. Room 5 contained a teenager who had wrapped his motorcycle around a tree, lucky to be alive with nothing more than a broken arm and bruised ribs. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the day shift supervisor, appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee. "Another thrilling evening in paradise," she said, offering him the steaming mug. Marcus accepted it with a nod but didn't smile. He rarely smiled. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that no one could quite place. "You know, there's a group of us going out for drinks after Sarah's shift ends tomorrow," Sarah mentioned casually. "You should join us sometime. All work and no play." "I appreciate the invitation," Marcus replied, already turning back to his charts. "But I have other commitments." Sarah watched him for a moment, her expression puzzled. In the 2 years since Marcus had started working nights at St. Mary's, he had never accepted a single social invitation. He arrived precisely at 7 p.m., worked his 12-hour shift with flawless efficiency, and disappeared at 7 a.m. Where he went, what he did during his days off, remained a complete mystery. The truth was, Marcus preferred it that way. The night shift suited him perfectly. Fewer administrators, less scrutiny, and most importantly, fewer questions about his past. During the day, he slept fitfully in his sparse one-bedroom apartment, plagued by dreams that felt more like memories. Dreams of dust and heat, of screaming and blood, of decisions made in split seconds that determined who lived and who died. The emergency department's automatic doors slid open, admitting a homeless man with a deep laceration on his forearm. Marcus assessed the wound quickly. It would need cleaning and stitches, but nothing life-threatening. As he worked, his hands moved with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and precise. "How did this happen?" he asked the patient, a man in his 50s with weathered skin and clothes that reeked of alcohol and neglect. "Broke bottle," the man slurred. "Cut myself trying to pick up the pieces." Marcus nodded, focusing on the suturing. The man studied his face in the harsh lighting. "You been in the service, Doc?" The question caught Marcus off guard, though he didn't let it show. "What makes you ask that?" "Something about the way you work. Seen field medics with those same hands. Quick, no wasted motion. Like you done this under pressure before." Marcus finished the last stitch before responding. "I went to medical school like every other doctor." The homeless man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Sure, Doc. We all got our stories." After discharging the patient, Marcus retreated to the break room. The conversation had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had worked hard to bury that part of his life, to become just another emergency room resident grinding through his residency. The last thing he needed was people asking questions about his past. At 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled to life with a transmission that would change everything. "St. Mary's emergency, this is dispatch. We have multiple casualties incoming. Possible IED blast downtown. ETA 12 minutes. Repeat, multiple casualties from explosive device." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. IED, improvised explosive device. For a moment, he was no longer in the sterile environment of the hospital, but back in the choking dust of Afghanistan. The acrid smell of cordite filling his nostrils, the screams of wounded soldiers echoing in his ears. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, burst into the break room. "Marcus, thank God you're here. We're about to get slammed. Some kind of bombing downtown. They're saying at least 8 casualties, possibly more." Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Something had shifted in his demeanor, though Jennifer couldn't quite identify what it was. His usual quiet competence had been replaced by something more intense, more focused. "What do we know about the injuries?" he asked, his voice steady. "Blast injuries, shrapnel wounds, possible crush trauma from debris. The first responders are saying it's pretty bad. Marcus nodded, already moving toward the trauma bay. But instead of following the standard protocol for mass casualty events, he began setting up something entirely different. His hands moved with automatic precision, arranging equipment in patterns that maximized efficiency under extreme conditions. Jennifer watched in amazement as Marcus transformed the trauma bay into what looked like a field hospital. He positioned gurneys in a specific formation that allowed for rapid triage and treatment flow. He arranged surgical instruments not according to hospital procedure, but in the order they would be needed for battlefield medicine. "Where did you learn to do this?" Jennifer asked, but Marcus was already calling out orders to the nursing staff. "We're going to need 4 units of O-negative ready for immediate transfusion," he said, his voice carrying a new authority. "Set up portable X-ray in positions 2 and 4. Get the ultrasound machine ready for fast exams. And I want hemostatic agents prepared for each bed." The nurses scrambled to follow his instructions, caught up in the urgency of his commands. There was something about the way he spoke, the confidence in his voice, that made them move faster than they ever had before. The first ambulance arrived with a screech of brakes and wailing sirens. The paramedics burst through the doors wheeling a young woman covered in blood, her left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. 23-year-old female, caught in the blast radius, the paramedic called out. Multiple shrapnel wounds, possible femur fracture, vitals stable but dropping. Marcus was at her side before the gurney had fully stopped moving. His assessment was rapid and comprehensive. Airway clear, breathing labored but adequate, circulation compromised by blood loss. His hands found wounds with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to bleeding sites while simultaneously evaluating priorities. "Get me a crash cart and prep for emergency surgery," he called out, but his focus never left the patient. As he worked, something remarkable happened. The chaotic energy of the trauma bay seemed to organize itself around his presence. Nurses anticipated his needs, equipment appeared when required, and a rhythm developed that felt more like a well-rehearsed military operation than a hospital emergency. The second ambulance arrived, then the third. Each brought casualties with injuries that would have challenged even experienced trauma surgeons. But Marcus moved between them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of life and death. He performed rapid field assessments, prioritized treatments, and made split-second decisions about resource allocation. Dr. Walsh found herself relegated to following his lead, watching in amazement as this quiet night shift resident demonstrated skills she had never seen in a civilian hospital. His trauma assessments were flawless, his surgical interventions precise and economical, and his ability to manage multiple critical patients simultaneously bordered on superhuman. "How are you doing this?" she asked during a brief lull between ambulances. Marcus paused, realizing for the first time that he had completely abandoned his carefully constructed facade. The muscle memory of his other life had taken over, and he was operating on instincts honed in places where mistakes meant death. "Experience," he said simply, but his eyes had taken on a distant quality. The fourth ambulance brought the most critical case yet, a middle-aged man with massive internal injuries, his blood pressure barely registering. The paramedics' report was grim. Found him under a collapsed wall, possible internal bleeding, pulse weak and thready. Marcus took one look at the patient and knew they were running out of time. In a civilian hospital, the standard protocol would involve extensive imaging, consultation with specialists, and careful surgical planning. But this man wouldn't live long enough for standard protocol. Without hesitation, Marcus began what looked like battlefield surgery. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, opening the patient's abdomen to locate and control the source of bleeding. The watching staff had never seen anything like it. Surgical techniques that prioritized speed and immediate life-saving over textbook procedure. "Where did you learn to operate like that?" Dr. Walsh asked, her voice filled with awe and confusion. Marcus's hands never stopped moving as he answered. "Sometimes you don't have the luxury of an operating room and 6 hours for surgery. Sometimes you have to make do with what you have and save the life in front of you." The man's vital signs began to stabilize as Marcus controlled the internal bleeding. It was a procedure that should have required a team of specialists and hours of preparation. But he had completed it in under 30 minutes with whatever equipment was available in the trauma BAY.AS. The immediate crisis passed, and the last of the casualties were stabilized for transport to surgery. An unusual quiet settled over the emergency department. The nursing staff looked at Marcus with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. This was not the same quiet, distant resident they had worked with for 2 years. Doctor Walsh approached him as he cleaned blood from his hands at the surgical sink. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He continued washing, his movements methodical and precise. What do you want to know? Those techniques you used tonight, that's not civilian medicine. That's combat medicine. Field surgery. I've seen it before when I did a rotation at Walter Reed, working with wounded veterans. Marcus's hands stilled in the water. He had known this moment would come eventually. The careful distance he had maintained, the deliberately ordinary life he had constructed, all of it unraveled in one night of emergency medicine. Where did you serve? Dr. Walsh asked gently. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Afghanistan. 2 tours. Forward Operating Base Chapman. The name carried weight for anyone with military knowledge. Chapman had been one of the most dangerous postings in Afghanistan. A remote base that came under regular attack and received casualties that would challenge even experienced military surgeons. What was your rank? Dr. Walsh continued. Sergeant. Combat medic. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw past the careful mask he wore. There was pain in his eyes, old wounds that had never fully healed. Why didn't you tell us? Your experience tonight, the way you handled those casualties, you saved lives that we might have lost. Marcus dried his hands slowly, considering his answer. Because I came here to forget, not to remember. I wanted to be just another resident, learning civilian medicine, helping people in a place where no one was shooting at me. The automatic doors opened, and a man in his 60s walked slowly into the emergency department. He was well-dressed, but moved with the careful gait of someone carrying old injuries. He approached the reception desk and asked to speak with the doctor who had treated the bombing victims. Doctor Walsh nodded toward Marcus. That would be Dr. Chin. The man studied Marcus for a long moment, his eyes taking in details that most people would miss. The precise posture, the way he held his hands, the unconscious alertness that never quite left someone who had served in combat. Sergeant Chin, the man said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus's head snapped up, recognizing the tone of command in the stranger's voice. Sir, Colonel James Patterson, retired. The man stepped forward and extended his hand. I wanted to thank you personally. My daughter was one of the casualties you treated tonight. The young woman with the leg injury. Marcus shook the offered hand, processing this information. How is she? The surgeons say you saved her life. The way you controlled the bleeding, the immediate assessment and treatment, they said it was textbook field medicine. Colonel Patterson paused, studying Marcus's face. FOB Chapman? Yes, sir. I spent some time there myself, back in '09. Rough posting. Lost a lot of good people in that sector. The two men stood in silence for a moment, sharing the understanding that came only from shared experience. Finally, Colonel Patterson spoke again. You know, son, there's no shame in using the skills you learned over there to save lives over here. That's what we trained for, to protect people, to preserve life. Doesn't matter if it's in Afghanistan or downtown Chicago. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a tension he had carried for years beginning to ease. I tried to leave it behind, sir. The memories, the skills, all of it. I thought I could just be a regular doctor. But you can't separate the training from the man, Colonel Patterson said. And tonight proved that those skills, that training, it's still serving a purpose. You saved my daughter's life because you knew how to operate under pressure, how to make quick decisions when someone's life hung in the balance. Dr. Walsh had been listening to the exchange, beginning to understand the depth of what Marcus had been carrying. Marcus, how many lives did you save tonight? He thought for a moment. 8 casualties, all stable. When they left for surgery. And how many might we have lost if you hadn't been here? Hadn't known how to set up that field triage system? Hadn't known those surgical techniques? The question hung in the air. Marcus knew the answer, but admitting it meant acknowledging something he had tried to deny for years. That his military experience, the skills he had learned in combat, were not something to be ashamed of, but something valuable. I don't know, he said finally. I do, Dr. Walsh replied. At least 3, maybe 4. Those injuries were beyond what we normally handle on a night shift. But you turned our trauma bay into something I've never seen before. You gave those people a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Colonel Patterson nodded in agreement. The measure of a soldier isn't the battles he's fought, son. It's what he does with the skills he's learned when the fighting's over. Tonight, you proved that your service didn't end when you left Afghanistan. It just took a different form. As the colonel prepared to leave, he turned back to Marcus. There's something else you should know. The bomb tonight, it wasn't random. Someone targeted a veterans support group meeting. Most of the casualties were former military personnel and their families. The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had been treating his own people without knowing it. Fellow veterans who had survived wars overseas only to face violence at home. Why? He asked. Because some people hate what we represent, the sacrifices we've made. But tonight, one of their own took care of them. A brother who knew exactly what they needed, who had the skills to save them. Colonel Patterson saluted formally. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Chen. Both then and now. After the colonel left, Marcus found himself alone in the break room with Dr. Walsh. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a complex mixture of emotions he had spent years suppressing. What happens now? He asked. Now you stop pretending to be someone you're not. Dr. Walsh sat down across from him. Marcus, you're one of the most skilled trauma physicians I've ever seen. Those techniques you used tonight, that experience you carry, it's not something to hide from. It's something to build on. But the nightmares, the memories, will always be part of you. But tonight proved they don't have to control you. You took the worst experiences of your life and used them to save other people. That's not something everyone can do. Marcus considered her words, feeling a shift in perspective that he hadn't expected. For 3 years since leaving the army, he had viewed his military experience as something to overcome, to move past. But tonight had shown him a different possibility, that those experiences, painful as they were, had given him skills and knowledge that could serve a valuable purpose in civilian life. There's going to be questions, he said, about my background, my training, and you'll answer them honestly. Marcus, the hospital administration is going to want to know how a second-year resident managed to handle a mass casualty event better than physicians with decades of experience. But that's not a problem to be solved. It's an asset to be recognized. Over the following days, Marcus found his life at the hospital completely transformed. Word of his performance during the bombing spread quickly through the medical community. Instead of being the quiet, distant night shift resident, he became someone people sought out for consultation on difficult trauma cases. The hospital administration, rather than questioning his unconventional background, recognized the value of his unique skill set. They offered him a position in their trauma surgery program, with an accelerated path that acknowledged his field experience. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time since leaving the military, Marcus allowed himself to remember his service not as a source of shame or trauma, but as preparation for a different kind of mission. He began talking to other veteran physicians, sharing experiences and learning how others had successfully transitioned their military medical skills to civilian practice. 3 months after the bombing, Marcus stood in the same trauma bay where his carefully constructed facade had crumbled. But now, instead of hiding from his past, he was using it to train other physicians in mass casualty management. His military experience, once a source of isolation, had become a bridge connecting him to colleagues and patients who needed exactly the skills he possessed. Dr. Walsh joined him after the training session. Any regrets about that night? Marcus considered the question, thinking about the man he had been before the bombing. Isolated, haunted, carrying skills he thought he would never need again. Then he thought about the 8 lives saved, the colleagues he was now training, the purpose he had rediscovered in serving others. No regrets, he said finally. I spent 3 years trying to forget who I was. Turns out, I just needed to remember why I became that person in the first place. The trauma bay was quiet now, prepared for whatever emergency might come through those doors. And Dr. Marcus Chen, no longer hiding behind a mask of ordinary competence, stood ready to meet it with all the skills, experience, and dedication that had carried him through war and back to peace. His service had never really ended. It had simply found a new battlefield where the mission remained the same: to preserve life, to fight against death and suffering, and to never leave a fellow human being behind. The night shift stretched ahead, full of unknown possibilities and potential crises. But Marcus Chen was no longer afraid of what the darkness might bring. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in foreign deserts, but in hospital corridors at 3 a.m., one patient at a time, one life at a time.